Well, you got a rough crew to work with, but.
Now, the only thing I need to make sure is that your camera is hooked to you.
Oh, that's right, I'm sorry. No, you're good.
So that's
Oh, it's locked on. I like that. I like the blinky of the blue thing, maybe. Or at least it was blinking.
they paid all that money.
Now, did you want to do the
Yeah. Oh, so
Hey, welcome.
yes, if you could do that.
All right, we're gonna adjust that closer to. Is it following you? I think it's following.
Dance.
There you go. Dance, my new friend. Dance. Okay. All right. All right, we good, everybody? Okay. Okay, just to open things up. Hi, everyone. Hi. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Amelia Island Museum of History's Brown Bag Lunch for April. I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. I like that. That's wonderful. So, for those of you who are familiar and for those of you who aren't, the Brown Bag Lunch is a lecture series that we put on every month, the first Wednesday of every month, and it's about all sorts of different topics. This one is history-based with our new curator, Tirik, Peterson.
Hey guys.
Hey, so he's going to be our presenter today. There are a couple pieces of housekeeping. Remember, if you like golf and you're interested in that, we have the golf tournament on April 10th coming up. We've been promoting it over the course of the past few weeks, and we would love to see more people there. The other thing that's happening is our right rail exhibit will be closing soon. So if you haven't gone down to the temporary gallery to see that yet, I would recommend you do so because they're going to start taking it down next week. All right. Tirik Peterson is our new curator. He's
Hello,
going to
guys.
be presenting our Brown Bag Lunch today. I'm going to turn the floor over to him, and once you guys are done, if you want to do us a favor and do the survey, that would be great.
All right, hello everybody. As you all know, my name is Tirik Peterson. I'm you guys' new curator. So today I'm going to be discussing the story of Fort Mose, the first sanctioned, legally sanctioned free black town in North America. Gracia, Real, Decente, Teresa de Mose. Well, for this presentation, I will call it Fort Mose. All right, so while the fort was majority freed Africans from the colonial British slave colonial states, it had small populations of natives, specifically Yamasee and other St. Augustinians as well. So Fort Mose was a mixture of African culture, Spanish culture, and native culture. So as we dive into this story, hopefully I can make clear that the African enslaved that were coming down to Fort Mose to gain freedom were adaptable, and they persevered using and manipulating the war between Spain and Britain to gain relative freedom. All right, so usually we think of usually when we think of escaped African slaves in the colonies going to freedom, we think of northern states like Pennsylvania and New York, but early in the 18th century, there were no free colonies because abolition laws hadn't been passed until the late 18th century, which would be during and after the American Revolution. So during the tensions between Spain and Britain, as they take different controls of North America, they were at a breaking point early in the mid-18th century. This allowed for enslaved, typically West African people in the colonies, like South Carolina, to maneuver between them to get to Fort Mose to gain freedom. All right, so now this map is a map of Kings Highway, also called the interstate of the colonial era. It was around almost 1,300 miles long, and it stretched all the way from Florida to Boston. Big. So this highway was essential for travel. It wasn't just an escape route, but it was used by everybody. It was used by Spain's forces and Britain's forces alike. So it was also dangerous. All right, so now the southern part of this highway which would be kind of right here-ish, was also called the Southern Underground Railroad. So before the official Underground Railroad came about, before and during the Civil War, this was used for slaves escaping specifically places like South Carolina to go down into Florida. Now, this is not the only way they would have went. They would also have used the coastlines as like cover. Because, you know, if people are using this already, then it's going to be hard because you have to dodge slave catchers in Georgia. Next slide. Before I go on to that. So, how was this freedom possible? So, Spanish laws and Britain's slave laws were different. And Spanish slaves laws were different because Spain relied on the Royal Edict of 1693 by King Charles II. This stated that in order to obtain freedom, escaping Africans had to first convert to Catholicism, pledge an oath of loyalty to the Spanish crown, and able-bodied men had to serve in the local free black militia in St. Augustine for at least 4 years. So then we have the next edict, the Edict of 1733. This kind of fortified the Royal Edict of 1693. Basically, they had to update it. So this stipulated that first, it made the rule that it had to be at least 4 years. It also said that there would be no reimbursement to British slave owners for escaped slaves that came down to Fort Mose in St. Augustine. And this is a big one, no escaped slave could be sold back to private Spanish citizens. So when they got there, they were free. And this Royal Edict of 1733 made sure of that. All right, next slide. All right, so Spain's slave codes had a different background. They were from different places. So the Royal Edict of 1693 was based off of Alfonso X of Castille's 13th century code, which translates to the 7-part code. Basically, this 7-part code meant that slavery was an unnatural state, which is different from Britain. In Spain, you could not be a slave just by being born. The routes to typical slavery were you were a prisoner of war, or you owed a debt, or you didn't convert to Catholicism. So it was different than Britain's. You weren't a slave in the beginning, which allowed for different privileges. All right. So these privileges were, people could buy their freedom, which is much different. You could sue your masters in certain cases. You could marry, remain as families, and I must put a big disclaimer on this. Just because these laws were put in place doesn't mean that everybody had to interpret it the same ways. The governors of St. Augustine, before the governor that legally sanctioned Fort Mose didn't honor these rules. They said, we don't want to make the British mad at us for allowing their slaves to come here. It was a royal edict, but we're not sure if we want to follow that right now, especially during these border tensions. All right, next slide. All right, so all of these escaped African slaves in the British colonies were coming down to Spain, and Spain saw this edict and this strategic move as a way to destabilize British colonies. The idea was, if we can get slaves from the British colonies to come down here, then we can destabilize their labor force. They can't grow things. They can't, work the fields if they don't have enough of that labor force. And so Britain responds, and South Carolina comes up with its own incentives. All right, so there became new slave catcher incentives, such as so basically they were giving more pay for slave catchers, and they were kind of fortifying the slave catchers, making it like more profitable and easier for them to organize as slave catchers in South Carolina. So for African slaves to get down to Fort Mose, they first had to go through Georgia. Now Georgia had a policy of it was a no slave colony, and that was because they did not want uprisings. They wanted Georgia to be a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. All right, next slide. All right, so this was more than just a place. Fort Mose represented something. So to the Spanish, Fort Mose represented a strategic buffer to British encroachment. And of course, to the British, it was seen as an act of war and political aggression. But to enslaved Africans in South Carolina and abroad, it represented freedom. So much so that in September of '39, only a year after the erection of Fort Mose, word got back to black workers in Charleston, South Carolina, and they launched one of the largest slave uprisings in the history of North America near the Stono River. This was known as the Stono Rebellion of 1739. Now, the Stono Rebellion was crushed before they could get to Florida, but this is an example of how widespread this became. This wasn't just in Florida or in South Carolina. People in all of the colonies were hearing about Fort Mose and a path to freedom. All right. So, now that we have established the broad strokes of Fort Mose and whom it comprised of, there are a couple figures that we need in order to ground this story. And I like to always place history in time and place and people. So the first one is Francisco Menendez. I love Francisco Menendez. When I first started learning about Fort Mose, he was the figure that I kind of latched onto to get more research. So Francisco Menendez, like other residents of Fort Mose, was a slave in South Carolina that escaped during the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717. Now, the Yamasee War was a brutal conflict between British settlers in South Carolina and a confederation of native tribes, primarily the Yamasee. So it wasn't just the Yamasee, but it was many tribes in Florida already battling the British. Now, the conflict started because British settlers were giving Yamasee Indians and other tribes debts that they couldn't settle. So basically, they were trading things with them and making debts, and the Yamasee and other tribes couldn't pay back these debts. The British were also encroaching on land, and they were also enslaving native tribes. So this kind of came to a boiling point at 1715. All right. Now, while the Yamasee did eventually lose this war, they did flee to Florida. And a person that they fled with, of course, was Francisco Menendez, who actually helped the Yamasee in the war. Now, this partnership would continue long after the war, long after the erection of Fort Mose, so much so that when the Yamasee and Francisco Menendez arrived in St. Augustine, Chief George, who was a Yamasee leader and he was very respected even by the Spanish, vouched for Francisco Menendez. And he vouched for Francisco Menendez because Menendez petitioned the Spanish governor to not go back on their promise of the Royal Edict of 1693. He said, hey, we've made it to Florida. We've gone past the slave catchers of Georgia. We've got here. Please honor your decree and let us be free. So Chief George then came in and said, hey, let me vouch for him. You know, this guy, he helped us during the war. He's a brave leader. And because Chief George was so respected amongst everybody, that meant that his word carried weight. And so, in 1738, Governor Montiano legally sanctioned the fort of Fort Mose, and Fort Mose was erected. And you go to the next slide. So, we're going to talk about a little bit about Manuel de Montiano, governor of Florida from 1737 to 1748. Now, this governor was different than the previous governors. He did not care about the British getting back their slaves or getting reimbursed. He said, we need a buffer between British and us. So, also, he respected Francisco Menendez as a leader. I think that was a big part of it. He respected him enough to not only make him military commander of Fort Mose, but its leader. Francisco Menendez basically functioned as a mayor for Fort Mose. He handled the administration, he handled disputes. He was the middleman between St. Augustine, and Fort Mose. All right, click that. So, Fort Mose had problems. Fort Mose was mainly built for military purposes. It was not built for agriculture. Now, when Fort Mose was beginning, St. Augustine residents thought that Fort Mose was going to make enough food and supplies to spill over into St. Augustine. But that didn't happen. Fort Mose was built on swampland. And if you know swampland, like most of us Floridians do, it's hard to build crops on swampland. So Fort Mose was pretty much impoverished throughout its entire existence. So Fort Mose and St. Augustine also relied on shipments from Mexico to stay alive. And when St. Augustine was hurting and they didn't get the shipments from Mexico because it sunk at sea or someone stole it, Fort Mose was hurt even worse because they got even littler supplies. And the biggest threat, however, to Fort Mose was the threat of British militias. So the British would routinely ally with certain Creek natives to raid Fort Mose all the time. So it's hard to farm when you have to worry about someone trying to, take your camp, right? You can't, all the men have to, stop and be like, okay, well, let's fight and then let's return back to farming. So basically, I say all this to say, Fort Mose, while it was a bastion of freedom, it did have challenges. And I think that speaks to the resilience of the people there. All right. All right, so now we get to the Battle of Bloody Mose. So as I said before, the British saw St. Augustine as a threat because of its fugitive slave laws meant to destabilize British colonies. So they would frequently raid Fort Mose. The British also feared that Spain might try and mount an attack on Georgia or encourage another slave rebellion like the Stono Rebellion. So all of this tension would eventually accumulate in the Battle of Bloody Mose when General James Oglethorpe gathered together a force of over 2,000 men, including Georgia and South Carolina militias, as well as British regulars and some Creek allies, to lay siege on Florida with the goal of capturing St. Augustine and reclaiming the escaped slaves of Mose. Basically, if you could capture St. Augustine, it was going to be good for you going on to capture other things in Florida. But before we get too much into that, we have to talk about General James Oglethorpe. So, General James Oglethorpe became the de facto leader of Georgia in 1733. Now, he wasn't the governor of Georgia, and that is because when Georgia was first established, it did not have a governor. It had a council of trustees. There were 21 of them. And the only reason General James Oglethorpe became pretty much the leader of that region is because he was the only one to move down there, which I think is amazing. I can't imagine if somebody else moved down there and it was like a fight for control or something. But yeah, so General James Oglethorpe would then be appointed as commander-in-chief 4 years later in 1737, which gave him full military control over Georgia and South Carolina. Right. He was also appointed colonel of the regular British Army and given his own regiment, which is called the 42nd Regiment of Foot. In September 43, he was then promoted to Brigadier General in the British Army. General James Oglethorpe was a particularly brave general. He wasn't one of the generals that kind of sat in the back. He was very much a general that stepped up forward with his men. And I read in my studies that he would also not use his riches if his men were starving. He was very much a, I'll sit with you, I'll struggle with you type of general. He was also European trained, so he relied heavily on siege warfare, and as well as his Scottish Highlander shock troops. And in my research, I read that the Scottish Highlander shock troops were basically an elite force, and General James Oglethorpe used them quite a bit. He was very confident in these forces. All right. And you go. All right, so let's get to the siege. And so in January 1740, General James Oglethorpe raided Florida, and he captured forts Pupo and Puco Lata on the St. Johns River west of St. Augustine. After these victories, the general was confident. He said, okay, we can do this. If we can capture these forts, we're already on a roll. Let's capture St. Augustine. A little overconfident. So now, once these forts were captured, word got back to St. Augustine, and in response, the Free Black Militia of Mose worked with the citizens of St. Augustine to fortify the defenses. So Governor Montiano said, they're coming, we need to fortify St. Augustine. We need to get back in the Castillo de San Marco, which was, of course, the fort in St. Augustine, as we all know. Now, before the General James Oglethorpe's forces came, they didn't know how much men they had. But they would find out because Francisco Menendez and Yamasee allies would go on scouting missions kind of north of Fort Mose, and they would watch the waterways and they would watch the valleys to see, well, how much men do they have? How fast are they going to be here? How much time do we have? So once Francisco Menendez came back, he said, Governor Montiano, they have like 2,000 men. We need to evacuate Fort Mose, and that's exactly what Governor Montiano did. He evacuated the residents of Fort Mose because while Fort Mose was good as a defense, it wasn't going to handle all of those people on its own. They would need to evacuate Fort Mose's citizens into the Castillo because the Castillo was a better fort, more fortified. Now, go to the next one. But before we go here, I want to do a tidbit about the Castillo de San Marco and St. Augustine. One of the things I love about that fort is it was never forcefully captured. Because it was built from a rare sedimentary rock called coquina. Basically, they would put coquina shells in the wall and it would form this almost impenetrable wall that when British cannon fire would come to it, instead of shattering like all the other kind of walls, it would absorb the cannonballs. So you're really just like, just dotting it, so it could survive. All right. So once Oglethorpe's troops got there, they occupied Fort Mose, and the people that occupied Fort Mose in Oglethorpe's troops were the Scottish Highlanders. He said, I'm going to send my best troops, and they'll occupy Fort Mose. St. Augustine will just stay in the Castillo, and they won't do anything, as he hoped. So that brings us to the counteroffensive. Now, the night of June 25th, Francisco Menendez, along with Yamasee allies, conducted the last scouting mission where they discovered that the British garrison, which were the Scottish Highlanders, were overconfident and they failed to keep watch. So Governor Montiano decided to do a counterstrike at the break of dawn on June 26th. So Governor Montiano assembled roughly 300 men, led by Menendez, that consisted of Yamasee and other Florida natives, along with the Free Black Militia and Spanish regular soldiers. The strike force moved 2 miles from Fort Mose under the time period would have been like just waking up in the morning. So the Scottish Highlander troops are in Fort Mose and they're still sleeping. They haven't gotten up and got prepared yet. So before the Scottish Highlanders could form battle lines, the militia led by Menendez engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand combat. So because things were so close quarters, people had to use knives and swords and bayonets to, fight. And that's why it got the name Bloody Mose, because when you catch someone off guard, lots of people die. So they engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand combat, and the British forces were so violent, the British forces were decimated so violently that's why it's got its namesake. The death toll of British losses during the battle were roughly 70, while Menendez's militia suffered very little casualties. But both sides were quite brutal, and the British accounts refer to the horror of the murder and the mutilation of scalping. So during this, British and Spanish leaders would pay natives to scalp their enemies, because that's how war was done back then, apparently.
It was proof that you killed somebody.
Yes. All right, Oglethorpe's retreat. So after Oglethorpe realized that his Scottish Highlander troops were decimated, the army's morale dropped. Our best forces are dead, so the morale is not there anymore. But Oglethorpe continued for 27 days to shell St. Augustine, and like I said previously, the Castillo was not going to be taken down by cannon fire. So eventually, Spanish supply ships got to, were able to get to Florida, and let me back up. General James Oglethorpe's plan for the siege was to starve St. Augustine. If you could blockade St. Augustine, they couldn't get supplies, they would starve, they would win the battle. So, because ships were able to get past that blockade, they were able to supply St. Augustine, and Oglethorpe realized that this isn't going to work. So, he would eventually retreat on July 20th, 1740. Now, the aftermath and abandonment of Fort Mose. So, while Governor Montiano won the war, Fort Mose was destroyed. It was decimated, burnt to the ground. So the residents of St. Augustine were moved back to the wider St. Augustine area, and they would stay there for 12 years. Now, before we get to the resurrection, you can go again. I want to go talk about the Battle of Bloody Marsh, July 7th, 1742. Now, as a retaliation for the destruction of St. Augustine and Fort Mose, Governor Montiano employed his Mose militia and other forces as a last attempt to capture Georgia. The idea was, if we can gather slave recruits from the South Carolina plantations and rise up against their former masters, we can gain enough people to capture Georgia. But Oglethorpe he saw this coming, and basically did a surprise ambush at St. Simons Islands, which led to the failure of the operation. So once the Battle of Bloody Marsh was over, Georgia was pretty much cemented as a colony. The Spanish would not do too many large-scale battles against Georgia, but in my research I did hear about some small engagements. All right, the resurrection of Fort Mose. So the new fort, they learned from this Battle of Bloody Mose, and they defensified Fort Mose pretty heavily. So after the destruction, they gave Fort Mose a moat. They gave Fort Mose, I don't know if you guys have heard of yucca plants. Basically, it's this natural barricade made from plants. And I didn't know about that either, so I was very excited to hear about that. And they put that around the fort of Fort Mose as a barrier, obviously. Now, the original inhabitants of Fort Mose were in Fort Mose for 12 years until the resurrection of Fort Mose II in 1752. They had been acclimated with St. Augustine. They married, they had children. St. Augustine was stable. It was more safe than Fort Mose. They didn't want to go back 2 miles to Fort Mose and be back in poverty. So the residents of Fort Mose were pretty reluctant to go back. Now, Francisco Menendez, as the leader, formally petitioned that he said, hey, let's stay in St. Augustine. Please don't make us go back. And he made a petition to give to the then governor, Fulgencio Gracia de Soli. Now, this governor was different than Montiano. He did not care about that petition. He said, we need a buffer between us and Georgia and South Carolina and Oglethorpe. So he ordered all of them to go back, pretty much. And that they did. All right. Oh, there's a climb. All right. So, basically, Fulgencio saw Fort Mose's residence as only a shield against the British, and so he ordered the fort to be rebuilt in 1752. However, in 1763, after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as they say in Britain, the Treaty of Paris was signed in Spain, which forced Florida to be traded to Spain. First Florida to be traded to Britain, and Cuba be given to Spain. So basically, after all that fighting, they said, we have to give Florida back to the British. And the residents of Fort Mose knew, well, if they're going to come back, then we're going to be slaves again. So all of them, well, not all of them, but some of them moved back to Cuba, along with a lot of St. Augustine residents moving back to Cuba because they knew that British rule was probably going to be worse. All right, so Fort Mose's future. So once the fort came under British authority in 1763, it was again used as a fort, obviously, during the 20 years that Britain was in charge of Florida. And actually, go to the next slide, please. All right. Go back. We're not there yet. All right. So basically, Florida was fine. Fort Mose was fortified again under the British, and then when it went back to the Spanish after the American Revolution, it was fortified again. So Fort Mose continued to be a fort until its abandonment in 1812. Now in 1812, it was occupied by a group of American adventurers known as the Florida Patriots, who intended to capture Florida for the United States, but of course they failed. And after that, Fort Mose was destroyed and pretty much went into decline for the years to come. Now, before we go to the end, I would like to say that eventually Fort Mose was taken up as a project by people like Kathleen Deegan, and it was refurbished, and she worked with a lot of archaeologists and geologists to map out Fort Mose, build it back up, and it's a site in St. Augustine that you can go to now. So that's my presentation. And before you guys go, I do want to say I've always been fascinated with Black resistance efforts and the often mixed race communities that they created. While Fort Mose's story is unique, it is but one of several examples of how enslaved Africans survived, adapted, and manipulated foreign powers in order to gain some semblance of autonomy, not only live but thrive. By now, hopefully some of you have a better understanding of not only what Fort Mose was, but what it meant and still represents in terms of Florida history and the history of the United States more broadly. Thank you for your time.
Yes. Great. I have to say, you know, I moved to Florida in 1975. I lived here for many years, traveled all over the state, learned a lot. I never heard about Fort Mose. I mean, I went to St. Augustine all the time. I knew about the Menorcans. I knew about every culture, bupkis about Fort Mose. Until recently, when Fort Mose was, taken up and we had a restoration of it. And now they have wonderful concerts there. It's a really wonderful cultural site, but it does make you think, you know, history is so much more than what you might learn, you know, just in school.
Yeah.
And this is a very big story for Florida. Never knew about it. I grew up in upstate New York, and all I knew about was Revolutionary War. We didn't talk about the Civil War. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. Yes.
What was the maximum population of Fort Mose?
So the maximum so there were roughly 100 enslaved Africans when they got there, plus Yamasee and other native groups. So in my studies, it kind of fluctuated, especially when people returned. It wasn't as big as it used to be. So I have to look up how much exactly, but roughly, I can give you that number much later. I don't want to tell you wrong, but yeah.
When slaves came down from South Carolina, did they have to live in the fort, or could they live in the surrounding areas?
So yes, so they could live in the surrounding areas.
But they had to commit 4 years in the military.
Yes, once the fort was built, so they had to commit at least 4 years under the 1733 edict in the military. Now, when they came to St. Augustine, there wasn't a black militia yet. It wouldn't be a decade. So when Francisco Menendez got there, a decade went by before they were able to be legally sanctioned at Fort Mose. So the St. Augustine residents also pushed for them to be moved to Fort Mose because the population was getting quite big. Yes.
Were there a lot of forts that were mixed like this, or was this unique in that it had blacks and Native Americans and other populations?
So this was only unique in that it was legally sanctioned. There were a lot of forts, well, 2 forts that I've read about, and there were also a lot of other places that had mixed race communities, specifically in Mexico and kind of throughout the South. There were little communities popping up here and there, but this was the only one that was legally sanctioned.
You mentioned the Southern Underground Railroad.
Yes.
Did it operate similar to the Underground Railroad I usually hear about?
So-
where people did them along the way and hide and all that?
Yes, so there were there were stations where people pretty much function the same way. You know, you get here, we help you out, we send you to the next person, all the way until you get to the same Florida.
Comment about the Highlanders, I did a blog post. They were very much against slavery, and so was Oglethorpe. And when the trustees voted in slavery to get rich like South Carolina, the Highlanders signed a petition against introduction of slavery in Georgia, and Oglethorpe left in disgust, never came back.
That's interesting. Yeah, when I was in my research and I read that Georgia didn't start out as a slave state and was officially banned, I was quite surprised because usually when you think of Georgia, you do think of a slave state. So, interesting.
Well, I think it was originally a religious undertone because they wanted to have Georgia for people who were in debt. It was like people taken out of the debt, I don't call them prisons, but whatever they were. The original idea was, I think you roll it on the tour bus, no Catholics, no lawyers, no slaves, no alcohol except for beer or whatever, and no Jews initially until they needed a doctor. And then they said, okay, come on in. And when the trustees voted in slavery, because as you say, he wasn't all powerful, then he left. He lived long enough to meet Adams for the representative of the United States of America. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Yes.
You know, one of the things that surprised me is in looking at the history of the West, when you look at Indian groups out there, the Indians had slaves. And when they fought with the other Indian tribes and things, then they would take slaves too. So I mean, you always kind of think of the blacks were the slaves, but the Indians could be slaves too.
So, and that's a big point. A lot of people, when the European powers came over here, they didn't have enough people to really just, conquer everything or anything like that. When they came over here, they relied on the native tribes to war with each other. Hey, if you fight from my side, I'll give you something if you fight them. If you fight on my side, I'll give you something to fight them. So yes, the European powers relied heavily on natives, especially when they first got here and throughout the century.
A lot of the native tribes that we consider powerful, like the Creeks, gained their power because they were great slavers. And, so,
Yes.
clean hands in that business.
Yeah. I tend to look at history not as who has clean hands, but as a complicated story like others.
I think it's also interesting bringing up other cultures that practice slavery in North America because the way that, I'd say that there's levels to it. Like, the Spanish, they engaged in slavery and they took prisoners of war as slaves, but they never engaged in chattel slavery, like how it would develop later in the United States.
So,
They didn't go into it like, I'm going to take you and you're not free anymore. Your children aren't free anymore. I'll probably take your family too, and you can
Yes, and that goes back to the Spain did not see slavery as a natural state.
Yeah.
So things were different. There are very much levels, and it depended on the time period as well. So this story is a complicated story, and it is also complicated through time. Very much in history, you can't say, well, this people did this, and this stayed like this forever, and these people did this, and it was just like this. It's more, what's the word? Dynamic. I like that. Yeah, dynamic.
Chaotic.
Yes, chaotic. I like that word as well. Definitely chaotic in my research. Actually, a little tidbit, if you want to hear. Francisco Menendez, 2 years after the Battle of Bloody Mose, he became a privateer for the Spanish, and he was on a ship that was, they were transporting something, and he was captured by the British, and the British tortured and feathered him to get him to admit that he was the Francisco Menendez in Bloody Mose. Now, I don't know how he survived, but he, even through his torture, he told them, hey, I'm legal. You know, I'm free, and you have to follow the rules of war with me. You know, so he continued to say that. So he was actually, became a slave in London, somehow was traded back to the Americas, and somehow in 1752 he was back in St. Augustine. So escaping slavery twice is wild. Yeah. That's just a little tidbit. I was going to put it in there, and I was like, how much time do I have?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right.
Thank
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. If you have a survey in front of you, please feel free to fill it out. We'd like to know what you guys are looking for in programs and what you liked about this one. If you've got any other questions, we'll be around for a few minutes, and have a very good day.
I just have a comment.